All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the JavaScript DOM. Now, DOM stands for Document Object Model. It's one of those names that's important for us to memorize. If you ever step into an interview and somebody asks you a question and they use the acronym DOM and you look at them like you have no idea what they're talking about, they're probably going to disregard you as an applicant. So please make sure that you memorize DOM stands for Document Object Model. And what it is referencing to is it's referencing to how JavaScript can actually interact with HTML. So we went over an example the other day when we were talking about HTML, where we covered a site that has a body. And let me fix this here. That has a body, right? Inside of our body, we may have a parent division, or actually, excuse me, we usually have a header. We typically have a footer. I always feel like I say footer in a funny way, footer, but anyway. All right, so we have our header, we have our footer, and then there's usually a main, right? Now this main division is usually what contains the majority of our content. And yesterday we did a deep dive into servers and how servers can communicate with databases. Well, today we're gonna go more in depth into how this content is created on a site. And then tomorrow we're going to go into how we're fetching that data from a server. But let's go back to Amazon.com over here so that we can take a look at it. So you can see there's this baby university books that people usually ask me about. I read a lot of STEM-oriented stuff to my daughter, unfortunately for her. So all of this content that populates on this site that we see here, we see all these boxes being populated, essentially divisions. These divisions have 4 different images inside of them, and it looks like they're just in a grid or some sort of table format, right? Then we have this little carousel, which looks like it's just a flex box with a little bit of an overlay hidden, and then an on-click function on these buttons that every time I click them, it scrolls this scroll bar a certain number of pixels, either to the left or right. So it either subtracts the position of the scroll bar to the left or adds this position of the scroll bar to the right to allow this image of, oh, look, we're scrolling through things without me having to actually grab on the scroll bar. And that's the same way that Netflix and other sites do it. All right. Great. So the division and the styling is likely something that we can do here in HTML and CSS. But what about all of these images and all of this content, right? Every day, Amazon.com usually has different things being advertised. If you have an account with them and you sign in, they have personalized suggestions that go to that one independent user. So where does that data come from? There's no way that a developer sits behind a machine and manually types all of these images and URLs for each one of these data points, right? Or each one of these images, including links. We have labels. There's just a lot. So can anyone think of a solution for this, or maybe some way that we can make this a little bit more dynamic to grab this information?
Use JavaScript, the DOM.
Perfect. So you utilize JavaScript. Excuse me, I took a bite. Utilize JavaScript to fetch this information or grab this information from a database. All of this comes back from a database. Let's take a look at the Poke API here. All right, so all of this comes back, and notice that the Poke API gives us things like, if I scroll down to sprites, we can see that I have images for each individual Pokemon. So for example, if I wanted to take a look at front default here, and I just place that URL, we can see that I get the image for data being populated, right? So just what is happening here? All right, so exactly the same way that the Poke API works, Amazon.com does some sort of request that returns a list of dictionaries for each one of these objects. It iterates through said list, and for every object inside of this, and excuse me, it's an array at this point because we're talking about JavaScript. For every object that's inside of this array, it creates an image that has an attached URL that will redirect you somewhere. When I click on said image, you'll notice here, right? It has the name of the book as an argument, right? And then it has a couple of other arguments that are being saved there. We'll talk about that later on as we go further into taking this a step further. But here we can see that it is one, sending not only the name of the book, but it looks like it's also sending the ID of the book. Right, so there we have a representation of the name and the ID of this book. That goes over to our backend server that we created yesterday. Right, it then utilizes this ID to fetch all the data pertaining this book from the database, and it sends it back to the front end so that JavaScript can manipulate the DOM and insert an image, description, all of these stars getting filled out, even this drop-down menu. That's all coming from being able to fetch data utilizing JavaScript. All right, and that's the basic functionality of full stack application and how the JavaScript DOM is going to be diving into this or integrating with this entire process. Does anyone have any questions over anything that I just covered? All right, doesn't seem like there are any questions. So let's go ahead and start diving into how this actually works. So we have our header, we have main. We could probably easily replicate this here in index.html just real quick. Let me go ahead and hand in that dandy tab. Let's do JS DOM. And inside of my body, I have a header with a UL. And let's do li times 3. All right, so there's our header. And I'm just going to add some inline style here. All right, so there's our header. Let me collapse this so we can see all of the code. Then we would have main, which currently I'm just going to have it with an H1 tag there saying hello Yankee. And let's just quickly do a P tag with some lorem ipsum in there. All right, and then our final little box here, which is our footer. I'm just gonna go ahead and copy and paste our header and paste that into our footer. Okay, great. Now, what does this look like? Let's go ahead and take this over to live server. So there's our header, which has home, something, and else. Then we see our body, which says hello Yankee. And then we see our home. Let's do a little bit of other styling here. There you go. Okay, so now we can see we have our home up above, and we have our footer. Right, everything is where we want it to be located. It's pretty easy to identify. Hey, this is a header. Here's my actual body, and here's my footer. But how does JavaScript actually see this model or what we've just created? How does it break it down? Well, in JavaScript, we'll find out that there's a parent to this entire body called a document. And when we access anything within the document, we are referencing the entire HTML document. So when I grab something through JavaScript, I will enter document. And let's say I just wanted to grab the second header, right? Well, document would then have some sort of drop-down tree. Now, this drop-down tree would then have a couple of branches. Well, actually, it would only have one, I apologize. And this branch would be our body. Now, inside of the body, that's where we would have three separate branches. What would those three branches be?
The header, main, and footer.
Right. So we would have our header, the footer, and then finally main. All right, so let me do a little bit of a scroll here. All right, awesome. So we can see how this is starting to kind of branch out. Now, how would we be able to access these? I understand the breakdown. Everything is boxes inside of boxes. And if I were to take this a step further, I could probably go down here. I could see that there is a UL here. Inside of that UL element, there is also 3 list items. That didn't work the way I wanted it to. Right. Right, so we can see there's a UL. And then there's LI. And there's LI. And one more final LI. Well, great. We have our breakdown of how the document object model would look like, or what the tree would look like of the DOM. But how do we iterate through said DOM to actually take a look at information? Well, let's go over to our JavaScript DOM here. And I'm just going to go ahead and inspect the page. I'm going to come over to the console. Now, inside of the console, this is your developer toolbars. If you take a look at elements, we've seen this already. It can break down what elements are being highlighted, what their dimensions are, their width and height. But in the console, we can actually write pure JavaScript that will interact with the DOM or with our document. Now, let's go ahead and break this down. So we've already talked about how we would access the entire document itself. We know that there is a parent named document. Now, inside of document, let's check if there is something like body. So inside of document.body, we can see that it's highlighting already what the body is, right? So if I go to document.body, it's highlighting the body and letting me know, hey, this is the object that you're accessing. Okay, great. Well, that's what I expected, right? I entered the document. The document essentially breaks down to a massive object. And inside of that object, there is a key named body. And that's where .body comes from. Okay. Well, what else is inside of .body? Maybe there's something like .header. But you'll see that if I try to run this, it gives me undefined. Huh. Well, the direct connection between document and body does exist, but moving forward, you'll have to access everything utilizing this children parameter. All right, so when I pass in children, you'll see that I get an HTML collection of an array of 4, right? Which we have our header, we have our body or our main, then we have footer. And this script is like an extra added thing. It's just assuming that you're going to have a JavaScript script working here. We know that it's not attached, so don't worry about it. We have our header, main, and footer. All right. So let's talk about what we know in regards to this document so far. Right, we've drew it out in actual HTML. We then drew out the tree, but now let's draw it out in code. right? So currently we have a variable named document that gets created to an object. Inside of this document, there is a key of body that holds another object. And in here, we found a key of children. And inside of this key of children, we have 4 separate objects, but it's an array of objects. One representing the header. We have an object representing the main. And we have an object representing the footer. That's as deep as we have dove into the document object model up to this point. All right, I've been talking for quite a bit. I'm gonna go ahead and take a pause here. Does anyone have any questions over how we're iterating through the document object model, how JavaScript is taking a look at this HTML and interpreting it into a massive object, or pretty much anything that I've covered up to this point?
So you said it was directly like a document dot body and then dot children and then whatever comes after that, then that's how it goes.
Exactly. So right now we go into document dot, and then the first key that we go into is body.
And
And
children.
there's
Gotcha.
another object, so we go dot children.
Okay.
Okay, so it doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So let's go ahead and dive deeper so that we can actually grab one of these li elements, right? So we go back into our JavaScript DOM. We've gone document dot object. Oh, excuse me, dot body. Dot children. And now inside of these children, where is the second list item located?
In the header.
In the header, yep.
Okay, well, this is an array of 4 positions. So what position do I want to enter? Or
And
what-
zero.
Zero.
Yeah, we're going to go into index 0, which would give me the header. And you can see that it's highlighting the header. Right, it's even suggesting it to me. It's saying, hey, here's the header. All right. And inside of the header, which property or which one of those key values do we want to enter?
Would it,
UL.
would it be UL or LI, one of the two?
Yeah, we're looking for UL or LI, right? But in order to access those, remember that we have to go into the attribute of children. Right, and there in children, it tells me, hey, you have a UL in here. So I could again access with index 0, and that highlights my UL. So if I'm following this pattern, what would be the next attribute?
Dot children 0.
Yeah,
Or
we
would-
go into dot children. And in this case, instead of 0, it would be 1, right? Because we want that center.
Mhm.
You can see that it's highlighting that li item. If we go and press enter, we can see that it gives us, hey, here's an li item. It has a marker, and the current text inside of it is something. All right. Well, now, how does this become useful to us? We're able to iterate through this massive object of objects of arrays. But what's the point of it if I can't change anything, right? Well, you can actually change things such as the text. So in this case, we're going to utilize inner text to change it to Yankee. And the moment I press enter, you'll see that it has been updated to Yankee. All right, so we iterate through the document object model to grab the value of this list item, and we then gave it a new inner text property of Yankee. And there's a couple of other attributes that are very common here. There's inner text, there's inner HTML, And in inner HTML, you could quite literally pass HTML. So you could do something like H1 Yankee, I guess. And that would change it to an H1 element nested within the list item. All right. And we're going to go into some other functions here that we can utilize to also manipulate the DOM. All right. At this point, does anyone have any, actually, before we open up for questions, let's go ahead and iterate through this dictionary here. All right. So inside of this dictionary, we do have something called a header, but the header is actually represented by the index of 1, and it has children. And inside of those children, we have a UL, which also just has children. And I believe I'm missing. There you go. And then finally, we had an LI item, another LI item, and then one final list item. All right, and now let me drop that. Let me make sure that that makes sense. It doesn't, because I am missing one of these. Right, so we iterate, we go into the children. This is effectively the header, which inside of the header, that was at index 0, we have children. Inside of these children, we had an object, which was our UL item at index 0, which also had the property of children. Right, so it's just a massive nested object inside of other arrays. All right, let's open it up for questions at this point. Does anyone have any questions over what we've just covered or how to iterate through the DOM? Let's hear it, Jacob.
Yeah, so like when we make changes with the DOM like that, are those like, those aren't updated or anything like in the actual page or the actual code? Is it just a temporary change or is it just, yeah, I guess that's a question.
Oh, that's a great question. So it's definitely only a temporary page or a temporary change. It's only supposed to happen while the user is utilizing the site, right? What we're going to create, or what the goal is to create dynamic sites that are adaptive to each user. So you'll
Gotcha.
notice that as you work throughout the stack, you'll write less and less HTML. You'll maybe write HTML for as a template, right? Of, hey, this is how I want the site to generally look. But the data and the content that's being loaded fully depends on what data is stored inside of the server and what page the user is currently on.
Okay, I got you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Juan?
This is a little bit more niche, but given that all of these are essentially objects, does that kind of affect runtime if you have way too many, for example, like an excessive amount of divs or something on your page, even though you don't really need them per se?
I don't think it affects runtime. It will affect your rendering. If you have a plethora of nested divisions, and to account for that, you could apply something like lazy rendering, which I don't think we cover inside of the cohort, but once we get into React, if you want to ask me about it, I'm more than happy to step aside and we go over what lazy rendering looks like in the front end world. Does that answer your question, Tom?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Of course. Owen?
Yeah, back to the rendering thing. Like if you use a class, like if you have CSS and then have a class for each div, does that shorten like your rendering time because you're directly accessing it, or is it still running through this entire like structure to render whatever you're trying to change?
When it comes to CSS, it's always going to read your CSS first. And that kind of depends more. CSS is very low level and it's not really going to affect at all. unless you have some crazy like 3D images that you're trying to render, then in that case, it might take a little bit more processing power. But most of the time, unless you have really terrible signal, have you ever had that experience where you try to go to a site and you see it loading on your browser, but the site is completely blank? And then all of a sudden things start populating. Well, that's it reading through all of your CSS, right? While the site is completely blank, it's processing all the CSS. And once the CSS is completed, then it starts populating content. Does that answer your question, Owen?
Sort of like if you added a class in the HTML and then like in your JavaScript or app.javascript file, you just picked out that class and it's like I want to change this once this button is pushed. Or you may have answered my question already, I guess, but you're using JavaScript to change that HTML element.
Got it. That's happening while the page is rendered. So no, it won't necessarily slow down any sort of rendering or anything like that. You should be good with that.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Gary?
So first, I think that was like the best way I've ever heard anyone explain the DOM. But following that, so with the children 0, and then children, which would bring you to the list of li, right? Uh, would dot child nodes also just display those three?
That's a great question. And yes, so child nodes will also display those three. The difference is that a child node is going more into like advanced data structures, where if you just enter it through children, it's just going to interpret as a list of dictionaries.
Gotcha.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Of course. James?
I was just curious, obviously as these document object models get like really large and there's like children inside of children inside of children, is children the only key that's used when you're nesting like a list of like other objects? It just seems like you could get really lost in the layers easily with that. I was just curious if there's any insight on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And to combat that, we actually have query selectors, or a way of selecting specific divisions by utilizing either class names or tags. And we're going to be diving into that here in the lecture shortly.
Cool, thank you.
Of course. All right. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. We're doing pretty good on time. So let's go ahead and keep going into our query selectors, or seeing an example of how this dynamically works before we start diving into all of the query selectors that are available out there. So let's open this up, go over to our JSON here. And instead of this lorem ipsum, I'm just going to simply replace this with an input form. All right. I'm going to have a p tag here saying, I'm just going to put output so that we can all visualize that that's where the output is going to go. And then I'm going to have an input of type text. And this is going to have a placeholder of type in your name. All right. And then finally, we'll put a button that says submit. All right. So there you can see I have my p tag with output. We have our input that is asking me to place in a name. And then I have the button of submit. So the idea is that I'm going to go ahead and type in Francisco here. And when I click submit, this output will change into Francisco. Now, how do we go into applying this functionality? All right. Well, there's a couple of things or a couple of methods that need to happen. One, since this is where my value is always going to go, I'm going to give this a unique ID of output. So I know that that's where it's going to be placed. Now for this input, I'm also going to give it an ID. And I'm just going to call it name input. All right. So now giving IDs to both of these is going to allow me to easily grab both of these HTML elements. And we can see this inside of the console as well. So now, and please don't worry about how exactly this works just yet. We're going to be diving into selectors here shortly. But you'll notice that before I was iterating through the entire tree, I don't want to have to iterate through the entire tree every single time. Instead, I have methods such as getElementById. And apparently I can't use enter, I get to utilize tab. And when I utilize getElementById, and I put something like output in there, and then I refresh or press enter, excuse me, you'll see that it returns that p tag with the ID of output. Right? So IDs are unique. So this is always meant to return one specific value. Right? And I could do the same thing for my name input, document.getElementById. And then I just put name input, close the tag, and it returns to me that input field. All right, so there's a really useful way of being able to grab one specific element. It's just getElementById. Well, let's write this in our script here. And let me make sure I remember how this goes here. All right, so we're going to go ahead and put a source tag at the, or excuse me, a script tag here at the very bottom. And this script tag is going to allow us to write JavaScript inside of HTML. So I'm going to say, hey, I want to grab my input field, or I'm going to make a function here of update name. This function is going to grab the name. By grabbing from the document.getElementById. And this is going to be name input dot value, because I want the value of what's inside of that text input. Awesome. Next, I'm going to go ahead and update that output. So what I'll do is say document.getElementById. I'm going to grab output and change inner text to name input. All right, so my function should grab my HTML or my input field in HTML, which has the ID of name input, grab the current value inside of it. On that next line, it's going to grab this paragraph tag of output and change its inner text to my name input. Well, now I've written this script, but how do I call this function inside of HTML? Well, buttons and most divisions support a functionality called onClick. So you can call an onClick function on buttons by specifying, hey, onClick, I want you to call the update name function. All right, well, let's take a look at what happens here. I'm going to go ahead and put Francisco. And I'm going to click on this button for submit. And now when I click on that button for submit, you can see that the output of Francisco has been updated, or excuse me, that the output text has been updated to Francisco as the text. All right. So we created a function within script tags. Notice that I put it at the bottom of the file. And actually, let's take a look at what happens if I put it on top. I'm going to go ahead and put it right underneath the body tag and try to execute this. Oh, this actually worked. I was totally expecting that to fail. Most of the time, you'll see that this fails. Maybe this will happen once we link it to a script tag or into an outside file. But typically, you want your script tag to be either at the bottom of your file, inside of your footer, or right after your footer. Or if you do put it in your header, you want to make sure that you add an async defer argument. And we'll be covering that here shortly, more in depth. All right, so we create this function. This function gets an element by ID, which is name input, which we know it's this text field. It then grabs the value of that text field. and sets it to a variable of name input. In our next line, we grab an element by ID, which is this paragraph tag of output, and we change the inner text to the name input. All right. So let's do that again. I'm gonna refresh. Let's mix it up and throw Jacob in here. And when we submit, we see Jacob being able to populate. All right. I'm gonna go ahead and open it up for questions now. Does anyone have any questions over how we utilize JavaScript to, one, write JavaScript inside of our HTML file, and two, utilize the document object model to update and capture user content inside of our HTML template?
Real quick, just to make sure I understand, the get element by ID is under the hood is doing the same thing as the children, like it's accessing that large object, but it's doing it for us just by accessing um that ID number or ID or whatever the ID name is.
That's a great question. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm not sure exactly how it's running under the hood, or how it's capturing the exact ID. But I do know that its functionality is it looks to the file, looks for the one instance of the ID, and once it has the one instance of the ID, it returns that element attached to it. I'm not exactly sure how it's running under the hood. I'll look into that and I'll get back to you with a more clear answer, Demi. I apologize.
No, it's good. The only reason I asked that question is because in the drawing that you had up, it was just like document body children or like children, but like in like the LI when we were trying to access it, it didn't specify or have like any other uh attributes, I guess, to it or any other key values, so I was just kind of confused.
Oh, got it. Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, if you go into the LI, you would still be able to dissect this. So you could still open this LI item. And inside of this LI item at index 0, you would also see that it has children. In this case, it likely has something like an array of none. It would also have something like inner text.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
This would be set to something like, I think what we had was something. And so on. Right. So all the properties exist within this dictionary or this object, excuse me. It's not just children, it's all of the other properties that we're utilizing as well.
Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you.
Of course, no problem. One?
We'll probably go over it later, but I was just wondering, is it better practice to use get element by ID if it is an ID instead of query selector? Or does it not really matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you utilize .get query selector, we're going to go into it here shortly, but I believe .query selector will always return a list, whereas get element by ID will return is specifically going to return only one instance. But we'll go into that here shortly once we start diving into the different query selectors. All right. Awesome. So it doesn't seem like there's any questions regarding the functionality that we just created. So let's go into how this, how we can update some content by changing color and utilizing different query selectors. All right, let me come back here. Let's take a look at our JS DOM. It looks pretty empty. There's not too much noise. That's good. I'm just going to quickly make some divisions here. I'm going to create some boxes here real quick. Let me go ahead and update these to 10. All right, so we can see there that we have 3 boxes. Let's change that to 15. All right, so we have our 3 boxes there. They all have the class of box. We're going to be changing these parameters for each one of these boxes here shortly. So let's talk about some query selectors. The first one that we're going to cover is going to be get element by ID. And we pretty much already went over that, right? If I go ahead and give this the ID of box 1, and then I come over to my console here and I say document.get element by ID. And I throw in box 1. We can see that it returns the div class of box 1. Well, great. What if I wanted to grab an element by class name? What would that do? Well, if I go into document.get elements, because remember, class names are multiples, right? So I go to get elements by class name, and I just pass in box. Well, this is going to return an entire HTML collection, all right? So it's giving me, hey, this is all of the different classes or all the different HTML collections that have the box class. And you'll see that it tells me there's 3 of them. So I open it up. We see box 1, box 2, and box 3. So when you utilize get element by class name, it returns an array. All right. Now, I can also do something like get element by tag name. And let's do document.get elements by tag name. Oh, no. I lost it. There it is. So get elements by tag name. And if I pass in a p tag, because that's all I want, is just a paragraph tag, notice that it returns still an HTML collection. So even though there's only one instance of it, it is still returning an entire array. And it's just saying, hey, at index 0, inside of this array, there is an output. So it returns an array of all of the selected tags. Right? So we could do that for p tags. We could do it for div tags. Any tag that exists inside of HTML, you can grab by get elements by tag name. Now let's go into query selector. So if I go into document dot, and let me make sure that everybody can see this. Ooh, that might have been too much of a zoom. Let's open that up. Let's say get elements. Oh, excuse me. It's not even get elements. It's just document dot query selector. And inside of this query selector, I just pass in, I could either pass in an ID or I could pass in a class. So I could say, hey, I want to grab box. And notice that when I pass in query selector with the class of box, it's returning only 1, right? And even though box is utilized in 3 separate divisions, it's still just returning the very first instance. All right, so there's the query selector difference. Now, if I utilize query selector all, and I pass in the class, then it returns a list of all 3 of the divisions that have the class of box. And then I could also utilize query selector to grab an ID. It's just instead of a period to signify that that is a class, I would utilize the # to signify, hey, this is an ID. I could say box 1. And it would return that very first division or that very first box with the ID of box 1. All right, so there's the difference between all of our different selectors. Let me actually throw that into a README here so that we have it. So select, yeah, element by ID returns only one element with unique ID. Then we have get elements by class name, which returns an array of elements with class. We have get elements by tag name, which returns an array of all elements with the desired tag. Query selector, which returns the first instance of the desired class or ID. And then we have query selector all, which returns all instances of the desired class or ID in an array. All right, and let me just fix this real quick. There, now it's not complaining. All right, and that is all of our query selectors. At this point, does anyone have any questions regarding query selectors? Or what are the different ways that we can either iterate through the DOM or grab something straight from the DOM by class name or tag name or ID name? Let's hear it, James.
Out of all these options, obviously tag, class, and ID like are very unique, but with the query selector, like using query selector all kind of on the surface seems like an efficient way to like grab things without remembering if it's a class or an ID. Do you have any recommendations on good defaults to use out of all of these selectors?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with query selector and query selector all, you have to take into consideration whether it's an ID or a class, just because that's the way it's going to look for it, right? If you specify something with a period, it's going to think that it's a class. If you specify something with a pound, it's going to think that it's an ID. As far as which one of these to use, I personally utilize get element by ID the most. And if I ever have to grab multiple instances, then I go by class name. But most of the time, I take care of that with React. Whenever I'm iterating through an object, I just make sure that they all have the same class and the same styling with functions. So those are my two. I know a lot of people or current developers, they like utilizing query selector or query selector all. There's really no, I want to say there's no surface difference as to what they do. They both accomplish the same goal, but there is less code or lines of code, less typing when you utilize query selector or query selector all. Does that answer your question, James?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? I see on the Yankee questions, Len shared something, which is understanding the DOM. Awesome. Thank you, Len. All right, it doesn't seem like there are any other questions, so let me go ahead and pause our recording. All right, in this portion of the lecture, we're going to talk about how we can utilize JavaScript to insert and create new elements into our HTML document. So let's dive right into it. I'm actually going to comment out the majority of this code here. And I'm going to talk about how we're going to isolate some JavaScript behavior here shortly as well. So I'll leave the script tag for now. All right, so now I want to actually be able to isolate or insert some behavior. So I'm going to call this, give this an ID of image container. And I'm going to create a button that will have add image in there. And all I'm going to do is every time somebody clicks on this button, I wanted to add an image into this image container. All right. And let me actually put some quick style in here. All right. So I just added some quick styling in there. We have our button, and now I'm going to go ahead and create this function for a button that will, every time we click it, it will actually create a image inside of this image container. Just going to steal this image from the Pokey API, actually. I think that might be best. And I'm going to start writing this function here on main.js. So I'm going to create a function called add image. And what this function is going to do is it's going to grab the image container. And we'll just utilize query selector in this case so we can see it. And I believe I utilized image container as my ID. Let me make sure that's how I spelled it. Yep, image container. Good. So that will grab the image container and return that division. And now I'm going to go ahead and create an image. And I'm going to do that by the create element function. Now this create element, all it takes in is the name of the tag. I want to create an image tag. I can create division tags. I can create p tags, ULs, anything that I would like to create in regular HTML. I can utilize it with this create element. But in this case, I'm going to create an image. And then I can access all the attributes that go to an image, such as source. Right? I can say, hey, the image source is going to be equal to this handy dandy string that we grabbed from the Pokey API, which will be our ditto. And let's just add some style in here. I'm going to go ahead and add a width attribute of 25 vmin, and that needs to be in quotation marks. I'm going to add a height attribute of 25 vmin. We'll go into what vmin stands for here when we go more into our React or responsive web design lecture in our React lecture. But for now, you can see that I'm creating a square for each image. The image will be containing our sprite of ditto. And all this is happening to the image that we've created earlier, right? And we have our image container up above. Well, now I need to actually add this image to the image container. And I can do that by saying image container dot append child, because remember, every HTML element has children, and the child that I want to append is my image. And let's just console.log image successfully created, so we could see it in the console. All right, so here we've written some JavaScript. We have our index HTML, and we probably need to call our function. So let's go ahead and do our onClick function here of add image. But notice that they're in two separate files now. I now have main.js and I have index.html. Well, how do I make my index.html show up here? Well, just like earlier in our CSS and HTML lecture, we were able to create a link tag. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to have a script tag with a specific source. So we're going to create a script. This script tag will have a source, and that source will be pointing to main.js. Now, because I am calling this on my head, this would try to render, meaning that this function would try to read and grab all of this information before it exists. Because I don't want it to do that, I want to add the attributes of async defer. All right, let's take a look at our JS DOM. Let's refresh it. Nothing is happening. That's great. We click on add image, and image is then added. And if I continue to press it, we can see that ditto continues to appear over and over again. All right, there's our ditto images, and they're all being generated through JavaScript. Every time I click on the button, the function of add image is triggered. We grab the image container, which is just a division. Once we have that container, we create an image element. We access the source attribute and give it the URL to this ditto image. We then access the style attribute and add a width of 25 vmin. Again, we access style and add a height of 25 vmin. And then finally, we grab the division and add a child, which is the image that we have just created. And then we get that console.log there in our console of image successfully created. All right, awesome. Let's open up the floor for questions. Does anyone have any questions over how I utilize JavaScript to create these images?
Do we only use script tags for like the functionality? Like when using JavaScript or whatever else would be running these actions?
Yes, so script tags will be specifically for JavaScript and link tags will be specifically for CSS. Does that answer your question, Jesus? Okay, fantastic.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, no questions. So let's go ahead and take this a step further. We want to add, not only do we want to add this image, but we also want to add it so that every time I hover over the image or I run over the image, maybe the background color changes. All right, so let's go ahead and add that functionality. Well, we know how to add event listeners on HTML. How do I add event listeners to something that exists only within JavaScript? Well, to do that, and I'm gonna separate it here a little bit. Just gonna put a comment of add event listener to image. Here, we're gonna go ahead and start adding an event listener. We're gonna go into the image and do add event listener. Great. Well, this takes in two parameters. The first is what is it that we're looking for? So in this case, I want to see every time the mouse is over my image. So every time my mouse is over my image, it will trigger an event. And this event is actually going to capture quite a bit. Let's just take a look at the event first. All right, so I'm gonna add an image. All right, and here you can see my mouse event. It triggers every time I hover over it. And this mouse event is an object that checks if it's trusted, meaning it's coming from the same source and it's not being utilized by some sort of bot that's just clicking through the site. It also tells me where it happened. So it gives me client X and client Y. So that's X 117 pixels and Y 82 pixels. Great. It tells me which element it is that triggered or where this was triggered. In target, it tells me exactly which element triggered this. So from element gives me the parent where this event came from, and target gives me the exact division or element that actually triggered this event. All right, and you could look through target. You can see that it has a couple of other attributes inside of it. We'll go into target more in depth here later on. Right, but the main thing to get out of this is that target will actually highlight that image value. So if I console.log event.target and I refresh this and add it, you can see that it gives me back my image source. Okay, so I'm adding my event here. I was able to add an event to this image and it triggers every time I hover over the image. Well, let's go ahead and do image.style.width. and make that equal to 26. We'll just make it a little bigger. And let's do, and actually instead of doing image in this case, let's just do event dot target. So wherever this event is being triggered, I want the height to be increased to 26 vmin. And let's add a background here. I think it's this way. Let me make sure. Let's do image dot style dot background. Yep, it's background color. Okay, great. So I did do background color. Good. And we could maybe do this like yellow for simplicity's sake. All right, so let's see it happen. We're gonna refresh it. We add an image. Let's add a couple of other images. And as I scroll through them, you'll see that their background colors turned yellow and that they get a little bigger. So now we added an event for what happens when I mouse over my image. You'll see that newly generated images don't have this event already triggered. It is only triggered once I hover over the image itself. Okay, well now let's go ahead and add an event listener for moving out. And before I add that secondary event listener, does anyone have any questions over how we did this first portion of adding an event listener for mouse over? What is an event? How we acquired event.target and added styles? Go ahead, Owen.
Not necessarily about how we did it, just more the formatting. I've seen where you add an event listener and then you put that function call, like where you have your block and mouse over, or you have your block mouse over and then comma calling that function. Do you usually do the entire function inside the event listener, like where you do the arrow? Or can you put that function below in your JavaScript document? What is the preferred format?
Got it. So what you're saying is more like if we wanted to isolate the code, right? So maybe we have something like const mouse over func, and this takes in an event.
Precisely. Yeah, just like that.
And it does something like this.
Yep. Yeah, what is, like, say if I'm assuming if it's just one event, one specific event, you'd probably keep it in that add event listener block rather than isolate that function. But if it had multiple event listeners where it does that same function, would you want to separate it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when it comes to how you want to do this, I think it depends on the amount of content that would actually go in there. So for example, currently all we're doing is changing the width, height, and background color, right? That's 3 lines of code. Definitely not something that I necessarily have to isolate and put in one thing, right? I could if I wanted to. And I guess if we're following the single responsibility principle, we would more than likely want to isolate all of our code as much as possible so that we don't have anything nested breaking within one another. So I think this would be more of the common practice of what you should be implementing here. Does that answer your question, Owen?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so now we have our mouse over functionality here. Now let's go ahead and go over a mouse out functionality. Again, this is going to take in an event, and all we're going to do is reset our values. All right, in this case, we wanted to go back to 25 vmin, the event target style height, go back to 25 vmin, and then the event target style background color to be, I think, transparent will work, but I may be wrong. we'll see if that throws an error. So now we could add image dot add event listener and put mouse out. And then that would just call our mouse out function. So let's add our image. You can see now if I mouse over, it turns yellow. If I mouse out, it goes back to its original size and goes back to being a transparent background. Right, so now we're able to highlight and see which one of the Pokemon it is that we're about to select, essentially. Right, we've added some dynamic UI utilizing JavaScript to our application. All right, at this point, does anyone have any questions regarding adding event listeners through JavaScript or creating elements in JavaScript?
I wouldn't say it's a question, but is this just like the same functionality as like, let's say if I had a calculator or just like a buttons on a website, when it kind of like highlights it to kind of let you know that you're hovering over something, like it like darkens it or something? Is that like the same thing this is doing?
Essentially, yes. That's the effect that
Okay.
we're there.
Okay.
All right, any other questions?
I have one more. Like, where would would you prefer to use CSS for like, because you can do a hover function in CSS, or would you always prefer like doing a JavaScript function to where it's using JavaScript event listeners compared to like a class hover in CSS?
Got it. So if you had to choose between one or the other, I don't think it's necessarily a preference. I think it's definitely up to you, right? Because as you said, we could always just do image.class name and then make that equal to, and then add the class that has that effect that you're speaking about. But if content is being created through JavaScript and you want functionality to be more specific to your site or to be more dynamic inside of your site, I definitely recommend doing it through JavaScript over CSS. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right. So now that we've gone over events, the next thing to talk about is event propagation. Now, event propagation is it's kind of how to explain this. It's essentially we want to make a stopper of, hey, this is when I want the event triggering to stop. So let's go ahead and create these new divisions. And so I'm just simply going to have a division with another division. And I'm going to have class box parent. I guess this for both the IDs. And I'm going to have ID of box child. I'm going to add some quick CSS here.
Hey, Francisco, sorry, but while you're doing that, what was this section again that you were talking about? I was still writing other notes.
The section that I was talking about, I apologize. Do you mean like stop propagation?
That's it. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. No problem. All right, and let's do okay, that was a lot more than just a little CSS, but it's okay. Let's go ahead and do a style here. And this one doesn't have to be display flex, just has like width of 25. In All right, so there we can see we have a box that's nested inside of another one, right? So we have our box parent, which is in red, and we have our box child, which is in gray. Now I want to add event listeners to both of these. I want to have an on-click function that says, say, hello. And I want to have an on-click function that says goodbye. Now, both of these functions are going to exist inside of main.js. Let me scroll these down. So const, say hello. Which will console.log hello. And then we have our say goodbye. Which will console.log goodbye. All right, so now when I click on the red square, we'll see that it says hello. And if I continue to click on the red square, we can still see it replicate hello. Now, notice when I click on the gray square, we get both goodbye and hello. Well, what's happening there? Why are both of these being triggered?
Your goodbye div is nested.
Yeah, my goodbye div is living inside of my say hello division. So even though visually I am clicking only on the gray, what I'm actually clicking on is both of them, right? I am actively clicking on both of these classes. So how do I fix this? Well, what I need to do is add a stop propagation argument. So I'm going to go back to main.js. I'm going to have both of these take in an event because an event is happening. It is an on-click event. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to add an event stop propagation. So now I'm going to refresh it. I click on the outer, we see hello. I click on the inner, and all I get is hello. So maybe I did that on the wrong spot. Let me go ahead and try it here. There you go. All right, so I had to add it on the parent division. So the parent division now no longer has a propagation argument. Okay, can I read properties of stop propagation? Do you have an error? Interesting. One click, say hello, pass in the EVT. I apologize, everyone. I'm running into a little bit of a debugging fiasco here. Got it. So I had to pass in the event. There you go. Okay, now it's working properly. I apologize. Let me go ahead and clarify this. So in index HTML, because I am utilizing an event, or the event attribute is being accessed here inside of these functions, I have to make sure I also pass in event as a parameter. But I have to actually spell it out. Otherwise, JavaScript won't be able to recognize it within the HTML document. So I need to make sure that it is completely spelled out saying event. Now, inside of JavaScript, we add this stop propagation to the child saying, hey, if you click this child, only this is going to be the event that gets triggered. If there's any other events happening at an upper division, I don't want you to essentially cascade or echo down. I just want you to stop as soon as my event is triggered. Okay. And if I click on the red, we can see the red works and the gray works. And that is how event propagation gets implemented. Does anyone have any questions over event propagation? All right, let's hear it, Jacob.
Can you go to I missed the part where you put the code in for the actual event listener. Where was that as far as like knowing that every time you click, it prints hello goodbye? Is that within this div right here?
Yeah, so when I put this on click function.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, never mind. I see it. I got you.
Okay.
I was totally like spacing out.
James?
Since you didn't actually add anything to the say hello function in the JavaScript, do you need the event there, or was that just because of the first time you put it in? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely don't need it there, especially since I'm not actually accessing the event or using the event in any form. I don't need to have it. There is an event that gets passed in. I'm just not accessing it. Does that answer your question, James?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
All right, it doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So let's go into the final portion of our lecture, which is going to be working with forms. Now, working with forms is extremely important. So this is probably going to be the most important part of our lecture. Moving forward, we'll be utilizing forms for pretty much everything. So currently it's 11:18. Let's go ahead and take a 7-minute break. Come back at 11:25 and just be ready to dive into forms itself. I'll see you all in 7 minutes. And let's dive straight into forms. All right. So as I mentioned, forms are extremely important and we'll be utilizing them pretty much the remaining of the cohort. And let's go ahead and kind of do our example that we had earlier. Maybe we have something where we capture the form output. Let's just do form output in there. So that it shows up. And we have an input that's type text. Let's do placeholder of what cohort are you? And then finally, an input type submit, which is just going to submit the form. All right. So there's our entire form validation. All right, we have our input type text. Maybe we have, let's go ahead and do something with this. Let's do let's do 2 paragraph tags, and here we'll do first name, last name. Let's do oh jeepers. All right, and we're going to give these name parameters as well. We're going to say, hey, this is a name of first, and this has a name of last. And so there you go. We have made our entire form there. We have one form. We have our first and last name that's going to display once we're done submitting this form. And we gave these a name attribute as well, first and last. Now, we've seen forms before, but we haven't really talked about how they function or how they work. Currently, right now, you'll notice that if I click on submit, it submits the form, but it also refreshes my browser and it adds all of my parameters to my URL, which works in a nutshell. That's not necessarily the way that I want it to function, especially when there's a user utilizing my site. All right. Instead, what I would like there to be is an on submit function. So it's going to say, hey, on const form submit, call it this for now. This will be taking in an event. And let's just console.log form submitted. Now, let's take a look at the console, what happens when I click on submit. Well, you'll see that my console like glitches out a little bit. It almost tells me that there's a message and then it refreshes. So it's refreshing the site, and that's why I don't see this console.log, right? So the form is a bit tricky because every time you submit the form, it's just refreshing the site. Well, how do I stop that from happening? And actually, let's go into index.html because I forgot to do this whole on submit here. And let's pass in form submit. Pass in the event. So let's try that again. We click on submit. You saw that message for like a split second. Oh, let me see if I can get it to pop. There it is. So the message comes up for like a split second, but then it gets refreshed. Well, how do I stop it from refreshing? Well, an event submission has a default behavior. So since we want to prevent that default behavior, what we're going to do is called prevent default. So now when I go to submit, it gets logged into my console that the form was submitted, and my URL doesn't get resubmitted. So if I go back here and I click on submit and I take a look at my URL, you'll see that it's still at /index.html. It didn't send any of these parameters to the browser. It is all working within JavaScript, and that is happening because of this prevent default. So that is very important that you utilize this prevent default. All right, well now, how do I work with the actual data in itself, right? We're passing an event. So what happens if I console.log event.target? Because it should give me the form itself, right? And let's put a little bit of some values here. Let's do FA, and we submit it. Well, event.target returns the entire form, but I would have to iterate through the form's children to grab all of this information. And if I have a pretty big form, like for example, a sign up form for some sort of site, I probably don't want to have to iterate through each one of these input fields one by one. So there's got to be a better way to break this down and grab this information. Well, there is. We have something called form data, which is a JavaScript class. So I'm going to have const form data, and I'm going to make that equal to new form data. And this is expecting a form. So I'm going to pass in the target, and then let's console.log this class here. So this is a class in JavaScript. It's initialized by passing in an entire form. I am passing in that form by passing in event.target. All right, let's try it again. F, A, and we submit. And now we get this form data, but it's a class instance, and it's giving me this weird prototype stuff. Not necessarily what I wanted. It's still not something that's friendly that I can work with. So maybe there's a little bit more that I can do to this form data. Well, I can say, hey, now that I have the form data as a class instance, I can grab all of the props inside this class instance by calling the object dot from entries and then passing in form data. And now let's console log form props. We try it again, F and A, submit the form, and now we get this really nice dictionary, or excuse me, this really nice JavaScript object that has the key of the name that I gave to the input field of first and last, and it has the values inside of them. So again, we submit the form, the event gets triggered. Event.target is the entire form with all of its input fields. We pass it into this form data class. This form data class does some restructuring of the data so that it's no longer just an HTML form. It's actually starting to look like some JavaScript data. And this object.fromEntries turns it into a JavaScript object so that when we console.log it, we can actually see an object with key value pairs, where the keys are representing the names attributes of the input fields, and the values are representing the input values of the input field. All right, does anyone have any questions over how we were able to capture this form without letting it refresh using event.prevent default, or how we were able to actually get an object from this form?
Can you switch over to the JS code really quick?
Sure. Juan?
Sorry, so the name keyword, that's specifically what's going to be assigning each of these, and then it's going to pass in that parameter that you give it as the value for wherever it's going to store it.
Yes, the name will fall as the key, and the whatever's inside of the input field will fall as the value. All right. Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, then let's finish out this process. We have this first and last name up here, which I guess we could just grab p tags. Yeah, let's just grab the p tags. So let's go into doing that. Let's say, hey, p tags equal to, and I forgot to add a let there. Document dot query selector all, and I believe we could just do p tags, and let's console.log these p tags here so that we could just see that there's two. So I click on submit, so there we get a node list of two with their individual text. So now we can do is say p tags at index 0, which is our first name, dot inner text plus equals, and then I could add a space. Excuse me. Oh no, my carrots are all messed up. How else could I get a backtick? All right, I'm not going to be able to get a backtick, so let's go ahead and do this number. Form props at first, and then we'll do the same thing at p tags 1 dot inner text plus equals a space plus form props at last. So now when I do Francisco Avila and I press enter, it populates as Francisco Avila up above in my p tags as well. All right, so I grab the p tags utilizing the query selector all, which returns an array. I then grab index 0 and add to the already existing inner text by adding my first name with a space because I didn't want it to be attached there, the colon, and doing the same thing for last name. I add a space and then the last name. All right. And that is it for forms, everyone. Does anyone have any questions regarding forms? All right, it doesn't seem like anyone has any questions. With that said, today we covered how to write index or how to manipulate the index HTML utilizing JavaScript with the document object model. We broke down the document object model in pretty good depth here by drawing it out. And I've noticed that you guys have been sending pictures of these drawings, so I'll start downloading the drawings and sharing them on Slack as well so that we all have them available. Maybe I'll post them in the README as well, just so that it's over in demos and notes. We also covered the different types of selectors that we can utilize within JavaScript to grab different elements and what their benefits are. We then went over events. We covered event propagation, and we also covered forms with JavaScript. At this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the material that was covered in today's lecture? Okay, great. Doesn't seem like there are any questions. Let me go ahead and